Imagine returning home from war and facing a horrifying fate instead of being welcomed home. Kamikaze pilots embraced a chilling destiny to become the weapons of destruction. But what fate awaited those who miraculously survived their deadly sorties and returned home? Join us as we dive deep into the untold stories of these kamikaze survivors and uncover the harrowing truths of their physical and psychological trauma and the lingering social stigma they faced. Chapter 1. Introduction. Kamikaze pilots were members of the Japanese military, specifically the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, during World War II. They were part of a last-ditch effort and deadly tactic used by Japan in the later stages of the war. Here, have a look at how a kamikaze pilot looked. As the war turned against Japan and their situation became increasingly dire, they faced a shortage of experienced pilots and warplanes. By early 1945, the Japanese Navy had suffered severe losses and was virtually destroyed. The threat of Japanese submarines persisted, but the tables had turned, and more of them were being sunk by the day, primarily by U.S. naval forces. The Japanese merchant fleet was also decimated, having fallen prey to U.S. submarines, which were now operating perilously close to the Japanese mainland. The U.S. submariners were so audacious that they took pictures of the Japanese coast through their periscopes as they conducted their missions. Chapter 2. Desperate situation in Japan. With the Japanese desperate for supplies, they resorted to using wooden sampans and traditional sailboats to transport goods. However, even these humble vessels were not spared, as bored U.S. submariners would sink them too, further exacerbating Japan's supply woes. The dire state of Japan's naval and merchant capabilities left the nation on the brink of an inevitable and devastating end to the war. In response, they devised the kamikaze strategy as a last-ditch effort to halt the advance of the Allied forces, particularly during the Pacific theater of the war. Kamikaze pilots were trained and equipped to carry out suicide attacks by deliberately crashing their planes, usually laden with explosives, into enemy ships, especially aircraft carriers and battleships. The aim was to cause maximum damage and disruption to the enemy's naval forces, as well as to instill fear and confusion among their ranks. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in late October 1944 marked the last significant effort of the Japanese Imperial Navy. The Japanese brought all their naval force together in hopes of preventing the Allies from retaking the Philippines and destroying a large portion of the Allied fleet. However, factors such as the incredible bravery displayed by U.S. sailors in Task Force Taffy 3 and Japanese misjudgment led to a catastrophic defeat for the Japanese. By April 1945, the Japanese Imperial Army had recruited thousands of kamikaze pilots in preparation for the Allied invasion of Okinawa. Some pilots volunteered willingly, while others were forced into the kamikaze program by the brutal treatment they received during their flight training. The kamikaze pilots flew their planes loaded with bombs and fuel at incredibly high speeds without slowing down, aiming to crash into Allied ships. While some kamikaze pilots were eager to sacrifice themselves for Japan, others tried to avoid recruitment by the armed secret police. Chapter 3. Battle of Okinawa. During the Battle of Okinawa, the largest effort by kamikaze pilots, they struck at the Allied fleet with determination, diving from great heights or skirting the waves to target ships. Although they inflicted significant damage, especially to smaller escort ships and support vessels, their hits on larger, heavily armored ships were less effective. Ultimately, the kamikaze pilots did not alter the outcome of the war, but their persistence and the toll they exacted on Allied ships led the American leadership to consider the potential cost of a mainland invasion. This, in part, influenced the decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan, bringing an end to the war. Many of the initial kamikaze volunteers willingly joined the ranks, eager to give their lives for Japan and its emperor. Even those who were somewhat hesitant at first eventually took pride in the sacrifice they would make for their country, family, and way of life. However, as tales of the brutal treatment during their flight training spread, more men were forced into the kamikaze program, though they were still portrayed as glorious volunteers. Contrary to the myth that kamikaze flights were always one-way trips, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean made it challenging for the Japanese to locate the Allies at times. Occasionally, relatively small and inconsequential targets, such as freighters or repair vessels, presented themselves as opportunities. Many kamikaze pilots returned to base for another attempt, hoping to find a more significant target like a battleship or aircraft carrier to crash into and sink. However, some pilots returned to base too frequently, avoiding their intended suicide missions. One individual defied the odds by returning 9 times, only to meet a grim fate on his final landing when he was pulled from the cockpit and shot. Inexperience played a role in the fate of many other kamikaze pilots. Some never returned, not because they crashed into enemy ships, but because they couldn't find any targets and ran out of fuel, or they became lost over the vast ocean, never to be seen again. The kamikaze's missions were fraught with peril, and the outcomes varied greatly, reflecting the complex emotions, motivations, and challenges faced by these young aviators during one of the darkest periods in history. If you liked what you saw, like this video and subscribe to our channel.